I was only weeks away from my wedding when I did something no one asked me to do. Out of curiosity alone, not suspicion, not fear, I began learning sign language. I told myself it was a gesture of closeness, a way to better connect with my fiancé and his mother, to meet them where they lived every day. Our home felt calm then, almost deliberately so. Wedding plans rested neatly on the kitchen counter, evenings passed quietly, dinners shared without tension, hands moving softly where words never came. I believed I was watching intimacy unfold, something gentle and rare. It never crossed my mind that what I was witnessing wasn't closeness at all, it was concealment. At first, nothing felt overtly wrong. Daniel had been upfront from the beginning about his mother, Margaret. She was deaf. She didn't speak. Sign language wasn't a preference for her, it was survival. According to him, navigating the world drained her more than she ever admitted. When she moved in with us, I didn't hesitate. The house was spacious, the adjustment seemed reasonable, and Margaret herself appeared almost fragile in her politeness. She smiled easily, moved carefully, and never imposed. If anything, she tried to shrink herself, as if afraid of being too much. Daniel naturally became her interpreter. When she signed, he spoke. That was the arrangement, and in the beginning it felt straightforward, even admirable. But slowly things shifted, not in obvious ways, in quiet ones. Conversations between them stretched longer while his translations grew shorter. Sometimes he skipped them entirely. "Nothing important," he'd say, smiling, waving it off like a fly. "Just everyday things." I believed him. I wanted to believe him. At dinner, they signed while I set plates down. In the living room, their hands moved while I answered emails nearby. In the mornings, they exchanged quick gestures over coffee before I was fully awake. I was present in the room, but increasingly unnecessary to the moment. No one ever asked me to leave. No one demanded privacy. Somehow that made it worse. I convinced myself I was being unfair. Margaret had no other way to communicate. Daniel was being a devoted son. This was compassion. This was what empathy looked like. I repeated that to myself whenever the silence felt heavier than it should have. Still, certain moments lingered. The way their signing paused when I walked in, then resumed when I turned away. The way Daniel's facial expressions didn't always match the tone of what he later translated. Once, I asked what they were discussing, and he hesitated just a fraction of a second before saying it was about groceries. I laughed and let it go. I didn't want to become the woman who resented a disabled parent for needing her child. Over time, the house changed. Not louder, not colder, smaller, narrower. Like entire conversations were unfolding in a space I could see but wasn't allowed to step into. I started choosing silence deliberately, afraid of interrupting, afraid of seeming intrusive. The more I withdrew, the more natural it became for them to fill that space without me. That was when I committed to learning more, not to spy, not to catch anyone doing something wrong. I told myself I wanted inclusion, understanding, a way to stop feeling like a visitor in my own home. It felt innocent then, considerate even. I didn't understand that the silence I was trying to bridge had a purpose, and it was doing its job perfectly. Understanding arrived quietly, the way it always does, without warning, without permission. By then, sign language had woven itself into my routine. I practiced in fragments of time, replaying movements in my head, tracing shapes in the air when I was alone, repeating phrases silently while waiting for meetings to start. I wasn't rushing fluency, I only wanted enough knowledge to feel connected, to close the invisible distance that had settled between us. That afternoon felt ordinary. Wedding paperwork was spread across the counter, the house was calm, orderly, almost staged. Daniel and Margaret sat in the living room, angled toward each other, hands moving in the familiar rhythm I'd trained myself to ignore. I told myself not to watch. I told myself it wasn't my place. Then a fragment caught my attention. Not a full sentence, just a motion I recognized before my mind could prepare for it. I stopped walking. Margaret was signing faster now, sharper than usual. There was no fragility in her posture, no hesitation in her movements. Daniel answered without breaking eye contact, his expression focused, measured. I didn't lean in, I didn't step closer, I simply understood. She wasn't asking about dinner or errands, she was asking about timing, about after. Daniel signed numbers, rounded figures that made my stomach sink. These weren't guesses, they were assumptions. Margaret reacted with impatience, questioning how much longer they would need to stay, how long they would have to pretend. Pretend. That word landed before my body caught up. Daniel reassured her, signing that I trusted him, that I didn't question things, that the house, the accounts, the obligations would settle into place once the paperwork was complete. Margaret smiled then, a version of her expression I had never seen. Not soft, not polite, satisfied. She signed something that made Daniel laugh. I understood that too. She referenced their arrangement, how convincing it had been, how silence made people careless. It wasn't a word she used, it was something else, something strategic, something shared. My body reacted before my thoughts did. I froze, not visibly, not dramatically. I simply ceased to exist in that moment. My hands went numb, the air thinned, time stretched between breaths. I stood in my own living room, watching my future discussed like a finalized plan I had already agreed to. Daniel glanced up and noticed me. His hands stopped instantly. His face shifted into something familiar, practiced. He spoke aloud, casual, asking if I needed anything. Margaret turned and smiled at me, the same careful expression she always wore. I forced movement into my body. I nodded. I said I was fine. I picked up a folder from the table, fingers steady despite the noise roaring in my head, and walked away without rushing, without looking back. Only after the bedroom door closed did I allow myself to breathe. The wedding date hadn't changed. The plans were still intact. Everyone still believed the same story. But I knew then that what I had understood was never meant for me to hear, and that understanding changed everything. I didn't confront him. That was the first decision I made once the shock loosened its grip. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded, staring into nothing while my thoughts sharpened with unsettling clarity. Confrontation would have felt good for a moment. After that, it would have been dangerous. Whatever Daniel and Margaret were planning wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, structured, and adaptable. If they knew I understood, they wouldn't panic. They would recalibrate. Silence, I realized, was no longer weakness. It was protection. I replayed the conversation not emotionally but strategically, what they assumed, what they believed they controlled, what they thought I could never access. Their confidence rested on one thing alone: imbalance. They believed they held information I didn't. That illusion was the only reason they felt safe discussing it openly in my presence. If I shattered that too soon, I would lose the only advantage I had. So I stayed exactly as they expected, calm, pleasant, focused on wedding logistics. I discussed seating charts, I talked menus, I smiled when Daniel translated Margaret's harmless remarks. I nodded when he said she was tired. Nothing in my behavior suggested a shift. Inside, everything had changed. I stopped listening emotionally and started observing patterns. When they spoke, where they chose silence, what they avoided saying aloud, which subjects made Daniel more alert, more guarded, more controlled. I noticed how often Margaret's signing changed tone depending on whether I was in the room. I noticed how Daniel never left paperwork unattended anymore, how careful he became with casual conversations. They were cautious, but not cautious enough. Freezing had bought me time, and time gave me clarity. I understood then why reacting immediately would have cost me everything. Anger would have made me predictable. Fear would have made me careless. Silence kept me invisible. As long as they believed I was unaware, they would continue exactly as they were. They would make plans assuming I was still the same woman who trusted them. That assumption was their mistake. I wasn't ready to act yet, not publicly, not decisively, but I began positioning myself for the moment when I would be. I reviewed commitments I'd postponed. I quietly rechecked boundaries I had relaxed for the sake of peace. I made mental notes of what could be undone and what could not. For the first time since learning the truth, I felt something other than shock. Control. Freezing hadn't trapped me, it had protected me. It kept the danger from seeing me clearly while I learned how to move without being seen. And as long as they kept talking freely in their borrowed silence, they would never realize that the person they were planning around no longer existed. I didn't need answers anymore, I needed leverage. So I kept playing my role. I stayed pleasant, predictable. I let Daniel believe the wedding had my full attention, while I quietly shifted mine elsewhere. The key wasn't speed, it was sequencing. One wrong move out of order would alert them. I couldn't afford that. I started with what was already mine, not dramatically, methodically. I reviewed commitments I'd rushed into out of trust. I slowed processes that didn't need to be immediate. I rechecked arrangements that would become permanent after the wedding and asked neutral questions that sounded practical, not suspicious. Each step was small enough to be invisible on its own. Together, they changed the landscape. At home, I stayed unremarkable. I didn't watch when Daniel and Margaret signed. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask what they were discussing. That restraint mattered. It kept their confidence intact. They continued talking freely about payments that would be easier to manage later, about bills that wouldn't matter once accounts were shared, about how temporary the situation was meant to be. They spoke like people already counting money that wasn't theirs yet. I let them. Instead of reacting, I documented patterns, timing, frequency, the way Daniel's tone sharpened when the subject drifted toward deadlines, the way Margaret's impatience surfaced whenever plans didn't move fast enough. I didn't need to record anything formally. I just needed to understand how their confidence worked and what it depended on. Then I began adjusting access, nothing that could be traced back to a single decision, just subtle recalibrations, permissions reviewed, dependencies reduced. I framed everything as preparation, as diligence, as the kind of responsible behavior people praised in a bride who had her life together. Daniel never questioned it. If anything, he seemed relieved that I was handling details he didn't want to think about. That was the irony. The more confident I appeared, the less closely he watched. I didn't cancel the wedding, not yet. Doing so would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. I needed them to keep believing the timeline was intact. Their sense of urgency worked in my favor. The closer we got, the more careless they became with their assumptions. Positioning isn't about attack, it's about alignment, making sure that when the moment comes, the outcome feels inevitable rather than forced. By the time everything was in place, nothing dramatic had happened on the surface. No arguments, no scenes, no accusations. Anyone looking in would have seen a woman calmly preparing for marriage. What they couldn't see was that the foundation beneath that future had already been dismantled, quietly, cleanly, and without a single confrontation. I didn't need them to confess. I didn't need them to panic. All I needed was for them to keep talking, keep assuming, and keep believing I was exactly where they left me. They never noticed that I had already moved. The unraveling didn't begin with an argument, it began with silence. 2 days before what was supposed to be our final wedding meeting, Daniel came home unsettled. He didn't say why at first. He moved through the house with tension he couldn't hide, checking his phone more often than usual, pausing mid-sentence when Margaret signed to him. Their conversations grew sharper, faster, less careful. I stayed exactly the same. When Daniel finally spoke, it wasn't an accusation, it was confusion. Something about a delay, a complication he hadn't anticipated. He said it casually, as if the issue would resolve itself if he didn't examine it too closely. Margaret didn't share his optimism. Her signing was abrupt now, irritated. She asked what had gone wrong. I already knew. The timeline they were relying on no longer existed. The assumptions they had made about access, about inevitability, about how much control marriage would give them had collapsed quietly under their feet.
not because I blocked them outright, but because I removed the shortcuts they were counting on. They began arguing in ways they never had before, not loudly, not dramatically, but with urgency. Their certainty was gone, replaced by recalculation. Margaret pressed Daniel for reassurance he couldn't give. Daniel, for the first time, didn't have an answer ready. The wedding didn't get canceled in a single moment. It stalled. Appointments were postponed. Decisions suddenly required more time. The ease Daniel had once projected was replaced by frustration he tried to disguise as stress. When he suggested pushing the date back just a little, I didn't resist. I didn't ask questions. I simply agreed. That was when the structure finally failed. Without the pressure of an imminent wedding, their urgency became visible. They pushed where they shouldn't have, asked for things too directly, made assumptions that no longer fit the situation, and when they did, the safeguards I'd quietly put in place responded without my involvement. There was no dramatic reveal, no confrontation in the living room, no raised voices or accusations, just a sequence of events that no longer bent in their favor. Daniel realized first. He asked me one evening if something had changed, not angrily, not defensively, carefully, as if testing the ground beneath his feet. I looked at him and told the truth, just not the whole of it. I said I needed time, that I wasn't comfortable moving forward the way we had planned. Margaret watched me closely as Daniel translated. Her expression shifted in a way I recognized immediately. Not confusion, recognition. They understood then that the future they'd been planning was no longer available to them. The wedding didn't happen. There was no announcement, no explanation offered to anyone outside our home. It simply ceased to exist as an option. And once that door closed, everything they were depending on vanished with it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was something steadier than relief. The knowledge that they had failed, not because I fought them, but because I stepped out of the role they needed me to play. If this story teaches us anything, it's that strength doesn't always announce itself. Erica didn't win by overpowering anyone. She didn't outshout the people who tried to deceive her, and she didn't rush to expose them for the sake of emotional release. Instead, she made a quieter choice, one that required patience, restraint, and a deep understanding of her own boundaries. What stands out most about Erica is not what she did in the end, but what she didn't do in the moment that mattered most. She didn't let shock turn into panic. She didn't let betrayal push her into reckless action. She gave herself time to see the full picture before deciding how much of herself she was willing to risk. And that's where the real lesson lives. Because betrayal isn't always obvious. It doesn't always come with raised voices or dramatic ultimatums. Sometimes it hides behind politeness, behind family roles, behind silence that feels harmless until it is. The danger isn't just in being lied to, it's in reacting before you understand what's truly at stake. Erica chose clarity over chaos. She chose to protect her future instead of proving a point in the present, and by doing that, she walked away not only unharmed, but wiser. So here is something worth thinking about. If you uncovered a truth that changed everything, but revealing it immediately might cost you more than it gives, what would you do? Would you react to the betrayal, or would you take a step back and decide how you want your story to end? If this situation made you pause or reflect, share your thoughts below. And if you value stories that focus on awareness, boundaries, and emotional intelligence, don't forget to subscribe for more.